Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a former Boeing 737 pilot and a member of the PMDG 737 tech team. In today's video, let's cover the single engine approach, the single engine go-around, and finally the single engine landing in the PMDG 737 in Flight Simulator 2024. But before we start, a couple of tips on the general aircraft handling on a single engine, because the most important point of this entire maneuver is that you have good control over your aircraft, and without you will not be able to conduct any of this professionally. So, starting. The 737 is a very nice airplane to fly on a single engine. You have a lot of maneuvering capabilities, and most importantly, it needs roughly the same thrust setting for most phases of flight. What do I mean with that? Well, single engine, the auto throttle is inoperative, and the airplane does also not have an automatic trim for the rudder. So that means that for every change in thrust, which we always have to do manually, for every change in thrust, we would also need to change the rudder input. Now, the autopilot cannot control the rudder in the 737, therefore it would look very strange how the airplane is flying when you're constantly changing thrust on autopilot. But luckily, Boeing are not idiots, at least not always, and they have built the 737 so that it needs roughly the same thrust in most of the conditions. And that is between 70 to about 75% N1 on the operative engine. You can see right now we're flying at 70% N1 and we're in a holding over here. The plane perfectly maintains around about the upspeed plus 20 knots. On approach later on, we will need roughly the same setting, about 70 to 75% N1 when we're in landing configuration. So on a 3-degree glide slope with the landing gear down and the flaps extended in flaps 15. And the airplane is, again, going to maintain the approach speed very nicely with that. That means that we should fly the airplane so that we need to change the thrust as little as possible. Obviously, climbs and descents will need a bit of a thrust change, but apart from that, intercepting the ILS can be done perfectly without having to change the thrust at all. And in this video I'm going to teach you how. Now, with that in mind, aim to maintain the thrust as constant as possible so that you achieve the smoothest flight possible. With that in mind, we can go ahead and start looking into the one engine inoperative landing non-normal checklist, which is the basis for everything that we are going to do in this video. So let's go ahead and have a look. I am using the old PMDG QRH from the days of the PMDG 737 NGX 14 years ago in Microsoft Flight Simulator X. Back then, Boeing gave out licenses to include original flight manuals. Nowadays that no longer happens, but I do own that product, and I therefore still have access to the old manual. Now let's go ahead and read through the one engine inoperative landing non-normal checklist. The condition statement is pretty clear. Landing must be made with one engine inoperative. Now, this checklist is normally done after it has been directed from any of the engine failure checklists. So, the first step is to choose one. Are we going to land using flaps 30 or are we going to land using flaps 15? Now, performance requirements for flaps 30 approaches are very strict, and normally we will not be able to meet them. The only real reason to use flaps 30 for the landing in the 737 with an engine inoperative is when the engine failure happens on final approach and you are already in landing configuration. In that case, you are allowed to continue the approach and land the airplane instead of going through the entire hassle of going around. So we are normally always going to choose landing using flaps 15. Let me go to step 2, and that is use flaps 15 and VREF 15 or VREF ICE for landing and flaps 1 for go around. If any of the following conditions apply, set VREF ICE, which equals VREF 15 plus 10 knots. Engine anti-ice will be used during landing. Wing anti-ice has been used any time during the flight, or icing conditions were encountered during the flight and the landing temperature is below 10 degrees. Basically what Boeing is doing over here is that they want to ensure that if there is any chance that you might have ice on your airplane, you will be using VREF ice, so basically just fly 10 knots faster. Note, when VREF ice is needed, the wind additive should not exceed 10 knots. That is because otherwise you're just flying much, much too fast. So remember, flaps 15 approach speeds normally around 160 knots already. If you add another 10 knots to that, then yeah, you're flying 170 knots suddenly. Now going on to the next page over here, we got maintain VREF 5 plus 5 knots or VREF ice plus 5 knots minimum on final approach to assure sufficient maneuver margin and speed for go-around. Note, auto-land operations are not authorized when landing with flaps 15 and use engine anti-ice on the operative engine only. And that's the checklist complete. So as you can see, there is not all that much that we're doing over here. We do have an additional go-around or an additional item that if additional go-around thrust is needed, configure for a no engine bleed landing, which is wing anti-ice off, isolation valve close, bleed 1 air switch off, APU bleed air switch on, left pack switch auto, bleed 2 air switch off. So that basically puts us into a configuration where the APU provides the bleed air and the engine therefore has full thrust available. Quite similar to what many flight simulators are used to with the packs off takeoff in Airbus aircraft. Now, go-around procedure review. Do the normal go-around procedure, except choose one, landing using flaps 15, then it's pretty much a normal go-around. But since we are using flaps 15, use flaps 1, maintain VREF 15 plus 5 knots or VREF ice plus 5 knots until reaching flap retraction altitude. Limit the bank angle to 15 degrees when the airspeed is less than VREF 15 plus 15 or VREF ice plus 5, or the minimum maneuver speed, whichever is lower. Accelerate to flaps 1 maneuvering speed before flap retraction. So as you can see, flaps 1 for the go-around. Apart from that, be careful with your bank angle. That's pretty much what this thing is telling you. And that's pretty much it. You do have one additional deferred item. That's to tell the GPWS that it should not annoy you when you're using flaps 15 for the landing, since 15 is only approved for landing with an engine inoperative and not for standard conditions. And that's the entire one engine inoperative landing checklist complete. So we've now talked about what we need and how we are going to fly the approach. So let's go straight into this and let's fly an approach and a go around. So flaps 15 is selected. We do not need VREF ice today. As you can see, no anti-ice requirement. And that's pretty much everything here. So let's go ahead and exit our hold and continue inbound to Whiskey Yankee Papa for the ILS approach to runway 13 left here in Cologne. We are going to descend to an altitude of 3,000 feet now, and the way that I would recommend to do this on a single engine is by going vertical speed, setting let's say setting an appropriate vertical speed, and thus just pull the thrust back by some 10% or so. We want to avoid large thrust changes. Generally, flying on an engine out, we are always going to take as much time and as much space as we absolutely need to. So let's take a moment to discuss the actual go-around procedure that we are going to fly on this approach. The single engine go-around procedure is very, very similar to the engine failure on takeoff procedure. So if we just go over our standard emergency briefing again, if the call before we want to keep going, there will be no actions below 400 feet except to cancel any warnings and raise the landing gear with a positive rate. At 400 feet, verify the appropriate roll mode and carry out the memory items. At the MFRA, which in case of a single engine go-around is usually 1,000 feet above ground, we buck up and retract the flaps on schedule, flaps up no light, select level change, max continuous thrust, engage the automatics, non-normal checklist, normal checklist, and that's it. So for us, the important thing here is that we will have a very strong yawing moment that's going to set on when we start the go-around, which we have to counter, and apart from that, pretty much the same thing that you would do on the climb out after the engine fails on a normal approach. So from this point, we still got to do the normal approach checklist. So let's do the frisk check first. Frequency is 110.9, set 3 times. Fixed rings, runway 13 left, 10 miles and 4 miles. The 4 miles is really just a reminder over here. Idents, India Kilo Echo Sierra, and that's checked 3 times. Standby instruments set, and course is 134. And that's it. Okay, so let's go ahead and configure configure for the additional go-around thrust. So when the airplane is below 10,000 and the use of wing anti-ice is no longer anticipated, that is the case. Wing anti-ice switch off, and the wing anti-ice is off. Isolation valve switch closed. Bleed air 1 switch off. Then APU bleed air switch on. Left pack switch auto, and bleed 2 air switch off. And that's the additional go-around thrust completed. So let me also turn off the fuel pumps over here, and you're not supposed to fly an approach with all 4 pumps operative, so we are going to turn off the right hand fuel pumps over here, anticipating that we are going to use some additional fuel here. Alright, so we are turning towards the final. Let's go ahead and start configuring the airplane. Again, we are trying to minimize thrust changes, so let's go to flaps 1 and set the flaps 1 maneuvering speed. We are cleared for the approach. Approach mode is armed, and we got Vorlog captured. Runway heading 134 set. Speed is nicely coming back. Let's extend flaps 5. Speed checked. And flaps 5. Alright. The glide slope is coming alive, and we can very nicely fly the airplane without greater thrust changes on the glide slope intercept. When you are half a dot from the glide, some people like to do it at 1 dot, I prefer half a dot. When you're half a dot from the glide and you're stable at the flap 5 speed, go gear down flaps 15, and by the moment you intercept the glide slope, you will be stable right on the target speed. Let me show you how well that works. So I'm going to set my 70% here again, which is what we are roughly needing to maintain the flap 5 reference speed. Now we are half a dot below, so gear down, flaps 15. Now look at the additional drag coming in, intercepting the glide. We are already below VRF plus 20, so we are already meeting the stabilized approach criteria. Works very, very well. Okay, this is all expected stuff here. Now we just need to adjust the thrust slightly in order to stabilize ourselves on the approach. Now, let's take a moment to review the go-around procedure that we will be facing. So, when we call for the go-around, it will be thrust. We gotta advance it manually. When we do that, anticipate the rudder movement. Also, since we cannot conduct a fail operational approach or an auto land here on a single engine, the autopilot will disconnect when we press the toga button. So anticipate that we have to steer the airplane manually, and believe me, it will be fun. You will also see me going a little bit left and right here. That's just normal, as long as you remain within the standard parameters. Okay, so all our procedures are complete. We are in landing configuration. We are fully stabilized on the approach over here. So eventually, at some point, I am going to do this rather close to the minimum for the sake of the fun of it. But basically at any moment now when we have to go around, it's going to be toga, set the go-around thrust, which is a large thrust change, positive rate of climb, landing gear up, At 400 feet, we are going to go for LNAV to track the published missed approach. Note that you could negotiate a go-around straight ahead with air traffic control. Always worth asking, because it's just easier. Today we're going to use LNAV and we are going to fly the turn. And from that moment on, at 1000 AGL, so top of the white band, we will accelerate. And once we got flaps up, no lights, level change, MCT, autopilot, and that's it. Alright. So, shall we have some fun? Let's already disconnect here. And then I would say, go around, flaps 1, set go around thrust. Positive rate of climb. Gear up. So, now we're in the situation that the QRH has been talking about. We are below the maneuvering speed, so we need to limit our bank angle. Quite a bit of rudder input required, as you can see. Alright, and we're going through the acceleration altitude, so buck up. Remember, we're in flaps 1 already, so we don't need to retract anything here. And of course I forgot to engage LNAV at 400, should have done that. So, flaps up. Speed checked, flaps up. So, flaps up, no light. Level change, set max continuous thrust. Okay, autopilot is on. After takeoff checklist. And with that, we could straight away start preparing for the second approach, or respectively decide if we need to do a go-around or something along those lines. So, reaching the target altitude, again, back down to about 70% N1, and as you can see, the plane is flying that absolutely perfectly. So now, let's go ahead and actually come back for a single-engine landing. So, left turn, heading 340, we just go over a very quick setup for the second approach. So departure arrival, Cologne arrival, ILS 13 left, execute. Let's just extend that center line down here. So that's going to be 134, intercept course, execute, thank you. We don't need to enter the engine out data into the FMC anymore down there. So further left, heading 310. Reselect the approach speed, so flaps 15, and with that we are basically set up for the second approach. So we would be doing the after takeoff checklist now, which is air condition and pressurization, yeah, pretty much 0, and that's all set. And altimeters, QNH 1018, maintaining 3000. Alright, after takeoff checklist complete. So, now we would go over the entire thing again, so descent checklist, deferred item, blah 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 blah. And talking about the deferred item, we forgot that earlier, flap inhibit switch to flap inhibit. Here we go. Alright, and that's the setup completed. So, in terms for what we want to do in our simulation over here, we can simply add a second... first check. So we got frequencies 110.9 are still active. Fixed rings 13 left, 10 miles, 4 miles. Items India Kilo Echo Sierra is confirmed. Standby instrument set. Courses 134. All of those are checked. So we can do the deferred approach checklist, which is altimeters and instruments cross-checked. Approach aids checked and set. Deferred approach checklist complete. Then we can also put the VSD on the pilot monitoring side, and that's it. Alright, so as you can see, it's really not a lot of magic. Now let's take a moment to discuss the changes if we actually want to land the airplane and how to fly the landing maneuver. There's a few things that we should take into consideration over here. So the first thing is that we had added quite a bit of trim down here. So our rudder is trimmed. So the moment we reduce our thrust for the flare, we are going to experience quite the yawing moment. To counter this, what you do in the real world is that when you go through something like 500 feet or so on the approach, you would ask the pilot monitoring to neutralize the rudder trim. That way you still have to use pressure on the pedals in order to keep the airplane flying straight while you're still flying. Unfortunately, in the sim, we do have a problem that we don't have pilot monitoring. So we just have to live with it that way. Now looking at this, we have a slight fuel imbalance on the left side, which is because we've been using fuel from there all the time. So let's finish the fuel balancing over here, so that we are using the right side again. That way we just gotta play a little bit of fuel ping pong. That's normal. That's what you have to do in the 737. Alright, and with that we are basically done with our approach preparation. For the flare itself, remember you're only in flaps 15, so you have less drag than you would with flaps 30. Also slightly different deck angle on the approach, but overall it's not too different and the plane flares really nicely, so not much to worry about. Alright, so let's reduce our thrust to 60% and then we can start slowing down to the upspeed already. At the same time, left-hand turn heading, let's say 220. So we are now already slowing down again for the approach and getting ready to intercept the final. In an ideal case, you want the speed to be down and stable at the flap 5 maneuvering speed by the time that you are getting close to the glide slope. So let's start slowing down early over here. Flaps 1. I'm going to leave the engine thrust as long as it's reasonably possible, so that the drag of the flaps simply leads to the deceleration, as you can see over here. Works very nicely in the 737. Alright, here's flaps 1, then let's go flaps 5, speed checked, and flaps 5. We are slowly slowing down, the glide slope is alive, looking quite good. Small tip for turning final: when you're about a mile from the center line at ground speeds below 180, that normally works pretty well to give you one continuous turn. Alright, so let's turn left, heading 160, cleared ILS 13 left. Approach mode is armed. I am just going to reduce the thrust a little bit further because I want to be down at the 5 speed to demonstrate you the handling capabilities here. So now we're down at the 5 speed. Looks like I overshot the turn. Okay. Well, then we have to descend a little bit further. So let's count it down to 2,500. Vertical speed. Like this. Alright, gear down, flaps 15. Again, we maintain the engine thrust exactly where it is. And here we go. Localizer capture, glide slope capture. Runway heading 134, go around altitude 3000 set. And look at that. We're established, we're right on speed, and all of that without a single thrust change. That's how easy it is. When you are at the 5 speed and you are half a dot below the glide, gear down, flaps 15, you can maintain the engine thrust. No going left and right because of thrust changes. That's how beautiful it flies. So that master caution is the off-scheduled descent over here, which we can simply ignore, because all that off-scheduled descent does is, if it detects that you haven't reached the cruising altitude, it returns the cabin altitude to your departure field elevation. So it says 50 down there, which is our original destination. Ain't going there with the off-scheduled descent, we're going right back to the departure field elevation. So we can't ignore that. Well, beautiful. And like that, you can see, very easily stabilized, very easy to fly all of this with the constant engine thrust here. Just beautiful. Alright, so landing clearance is received. Then let's go ahead and disconnect the autopilot and fly the rest manually. Note that we always disconnect the autopilot when doing simulator training, which is a regulatory requirement. They require you to manually fly a single engine approach in your recurrent simulator. In the real world, you can leave the autopilot in all the way to the minimum use height, which in the 737 is 158 feet. So very easy going. Alright, going through 1,000 feet, fully stabilized already. Gaining a little bit of speed, so I'm just reducing my thrust a slight bit over here. At this moment, I would recommend, if you have a button assigned to simply cancel out your rudder trim, do that now. And then just use the rudder manually to maintain your coordinated flight. All right. As you can see, that works very easily. So, when we start the flare, thrust idle, anticipate the yawing moment, anticipate that you have less drag than you normally would, so the airplane is going to flare a little bit better, and most importantly, don't make it a smooth landing, make it
50,
a good
40,
landing by the book.
30, 20,
Idle,
10.
don't flare, here we go. So, anticipate that the thrust reversers are working asymmetrically, so it will be pulling you a little bit to the side of the operative engine, which you got to counter with the rudder. As you can see, not a problem at all. And with that, we are already passing 60 knots. So let's go back to idle. Manual brakes. And, well, that's everything there is to this. So, thank you very much for watching. I do hope you found this one interesting. As you can see, it's really no rocket science flying single engine. The plane is built very, very well by Boeing. So, all I can say is thank you very much for watching. As always, like, comment and subscribe. And if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.